Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Miss V's True Historical Stories. I'm your host, Ms. Viola, and today we're going to be talking about two presidents that have very different reputations in our nation's past. One is considered one of the most loved and greatest presidents that our country has ever known, while the other, he doesn't have quite the same reputation. Now it's important to know they both were president during one of the worst times in our nation's past, and they both responded in very different ways. So were they the greatest and worst presidents our country has ever known? Well, that's going to be for you to decide. So let's get started. On this side of the ring, we've got Hoover. Not that Hoover, Herbert Hoover. But this picture might be a little bit important later on, so we're going to save it. Good. Herbert Hoover. And on this side, we've got Roosevelt. Not that Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Perfect. Hoover versus FDR. Now, like I said, they were both president during one of the worst times in our nation's past, the Great Depression, which happened in the 1930s. During this time, there were millions of people that were out of work, that were starving, and couldn't afford to house their families. So how did they respond? Let's start with Hoover. Herbert Hoover was the 31st president of the United States. He was a Republican, and he was elected to office in 1929, which you should also know is the first year that the stock market crashed in the United States. Hoover was famous for saying that we in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. That's a pretty bold statement to make, and unfortunately for Hoover, in just a few short years there would be people dying on the street from starvation. Now, Hoover was a businessman. He was a firm believer in a small federal government that had limited control over the economic sphere. He believed that if the economy was broken, that in time it would repair itself, and until that happened, only states and local governments should be handling recovery efforts, like giving people jobs. Now, what about all those people dying on the street from starvation? Well, Hoover had a response for them as well. He believed that only social groups such as charities and churches should be providing relief to the people that were struggling during the Great Depression. He believed that the soup kitchens and homeless shelters that they provided would be enough relief for those people. Now, Hoover also believed in something called trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics is a theory that states that the government gives tax breaks to those big corporations at the top. Eventually, the wealth will trickle down to everybody else through the forms of jobs and economic spending. Now, did it work? Well, why do you ask all those hundreds of people living in Hoovervilles? And all those people sleeping under their Hoover blankets? And don't forget about the people drinking their Hoover soup. And oh yeah, all those people not driving their Hoover cars because they couldn't afford the gas to drive them. That's right. Anything negative during the Great Depression became associated with Herbert Hoover. And that's because the people were sick and tired of his laissez-faire form of government, which means hands off the economy. You know what? Let's bring up that picture of the vacuum. I said that would be helpful a little bit later on. Great. Now, the majority of the American people thought, just like this vacuum, Hoover sucked. He was not providing the relief and support that people needed during the Great Depression. And even though he started to provide jobs near the end of his presidency through public work programs, it was too little, too late. Okay, so let's talk about FDR. Now, we have Clark Kent, Peter Parker, Bruce Wayne, and FDR. Well, to many during the Great Depression, FDR was a superhero. He came into the presidency in 1933 with some big problems that he needed to solve, but he had some big plans about how he was going to fix those problems. Now, Hoover and FDR did have some important beliefs in common. For example, both Hoover and FDR believed that the key to economic recovery was confidence. They both believed that the American people needed to be confident in the economy for it to fix itself. Now, the way that FDR planned to instill that confidence was through weekly fireside chats. Fireside chats were radio broadcasts that went into the homes of everyday Americans, and FDR would talk to them about his plans for getting out of the Great Depression and getting the American people back on their feet. Now, this did a lot for FDR's reputation during the Great Depression. He became a father figure, a friend, and someone that the American people could really trust and rely on. unlike Herbert Hoover. Now, like I said, FDR came into the presidency with some big plans about how he was going to fix the problems during the Great Depression. During his first 100 days as president, he passed through many bills and laws that aimed to provide relief, recovery, and reform. Now, these 3 R's are very important. And when I say important, I mean Regents exam, so pay attention. Relief is providing immediate assistance to the people that needed it during the Great Depression. Recovery is giving people jobs and getting them back to work. And reform is changing the laws to make sure that the Great Depression never happened again. Now, these 3 R's are a lot like recycling. When you recycle, you're putting something in and you're getting something good out, like a good environment. FDR thought about relief, recovery, and reform in the same way. He believed that if he gave people money to eat, got them back to work, and changed the laws to make sure this never happened again, he would get something really good in return. No more depression. Now, these plans for the Great Depression became known as the New Deal. And the New Deal was much different from Herbert Hoover's plans to get out of the Great Depression. FDR believed that the government's job was to directly stimulate economic recovery, and he did not care how big the federal government got. Now, it's also important to know that during FDR's term as president, the government started spending on a deficit budget. This means spending more than you have. Does that sound familiar? It's what's happening today as well. Now, FDR's plans for the Great Depression also became known as alphabet soup. We have the FDIC, the TVA, the AAA, the WPA, and the CCC. All of these were New Deal programs that were aimed to provide relief, recovery, and reform. And they might not mean much to you yet, but they will next week during our next episode. Okay, let's recap. Hoover refused to provide direct assistance to the American people during the Great Depression because he believed in laissez-faire economics. He believed that the economy would fix itself in time. And until that happened, the only people responsible for providing relief to the American people should be social groups such as churches and charity organizations. Like this cat here, Hoover was telling the government, hands off the economy. Now, FDR, on the other hand, he did believe that the federal government should play a large role in helping the American people. And through his New Deal, he provided relief, recovery, and reform to the American people during the Great Depression. And that's it for our episode today. Look out for next week's show where we begin to discuss FDR's New Deal programs in greater detail. And you'll finally find out what all of those alphabet soup mean. And as always, I promise to provide you the true historical stories and probably some more cats.